Hi, this is Alan Wyndham. I'm a professor of plant pathology and extension specialist with UT Extension. I'm located in Nashville at the Soil Plant Pest Center, and thanks for watching this video. It's been an interesting year, and I'm sure it's been an interesting year for everybody. Um, I've been covering for the plant diagnostician position for a good bit of the summer. We've got a new diagnostician, Eleanor Phillips, and we're very happy to have her on staff. I've looked at over 1,000 specimens today. One of the things I thought I'd do for this recording is just focus on one group of plants, and I'm going to focus on oaks. And the reason I'm focusing on oaks is because I think when I look back over my records, I had diagnosed over 33 different problems on oaks this year. So just a very topical subject and a very popular plant, a great plant to use in the landscape. So before I get started, I'd like to look at, just mention our social media platforms here at the Soil Plant Pest Center. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Here's the Facebook page for the Soil Plant Pest Center. It's one of our most popular platforms that we use to share information about insects that are active, diseases that are active, and there's always interesting things. Dr. Hell's always putting up interesting posts about various insects, some that are just nuisance, some that are big problems, some that are new and exotic. People are sending us photos that we post. Try to post something almost every day during the season. As far as fungi, I post things that of interest about things that people ask us about. I'll mention this later, but the jack-o'-lantern mushroom is out now, and you may be familiar with it. It's the one that glows in the dark. More on that later. It's also the season for black root rot on pansy and viola. So if you are buying violas or pansies, always inspect the roots, and they should look like this on the left. You should have a nice root system. If you don't, if you look at the plants you're looking at look like the ones on the right, and there's a possibility that it might have black root rot. You would not want to buy that plant. The other thing that we may see, and I've heard of some cases already, and that's Pythium blight. Sometimes it shows up in the fall on overseeded lawns, sometimes on cool season lawns, and even Bermuda grass in the fall. So you'll get this white cottony growth as the grass is going into dormancy. It's susceptible. And if there's poor drainage or excess irrigation, lots of rainfall, then you might see Pythium blight. But those are the kind of things that we post and talk about on the Soil Plant Pest Center on Facebook. So if you're not following us, I hope that you will. And always share. If you'd like to share any of the things that we post to your group or for your business, feel free to do that. We welcome that. The other platform that I use is Twitter, and you can follow me. You can just look me up, Alan Wyndham, and find me, or you can look at my Twitter handle, UTPlantDoc, and I do a little different things on here. Some of the same things, but I'll post things that are unusual. This is a European hornbeam with bullseye leaf spot that we got in last week. Really interesting disease. Not real common, but does show up from time to time. It's a quality pest. And then this is something I tweeted about last week that I thought was interesting. You know, most of the mushrooms that are found under trees are mycorrhizal, and the boletes, where they have pores rather than gills, are no different. But this is an ash bolete, and it's a little different. It does not really form an association with the roots of ash. However, it does have a symbiotic relationship with the woolly ash aphid. And the symbiosis works this way, that the mushroom forms a mantle, a barrier, a protective barrier around the insects while they feed on the roots of ash. And then the aphids produce honeydew that benefits the mushroom. So just a cool little thing. And if you If you found those bolets under an ash and you dug them up, you might find roots that look like this, where you have these little things that look like galls. They're not really galls. What they are, it's mycelium surrounding the aphids that are feeding on the roots. So those are the kind of things that I post about, things that are a little bit unusual on, I'll post those things on Twitter, and all kinds of things about fungi, sometimes insects. I posted about, last week I posted about our first case of boxwood blight this fall. So it definitely is active. I've seen a few cases in September. And the way that you diagnose it are the leaf spots and the dark lesions on the twigs. And usually you can find it producing spores either on the twigs or on the leaf spots. So give me a follow on Twitter, and I'll keep you up to date on what's going on as far as diseases of trees, shrubs, and turf grass. All right. So I'm back, and I am going to try to share my PowerPoint presentation now. And let's see if I can do this. There we go. Stop sharing, make sure I'm sharing the right thing here. Get into screen show first. Bear with me. Here we go. Now, I think I've got it. There we go. That should be it. So, I think, as I mentioned, I looked at over 1,000 plant samples this summer. It's been busy. People were at home. They were seeing things. Businesses are still, if you're in lawn care, grounds maintenance, you still have customers to deal with, still have problems to deal with, and that's why we're here. We're here to help you identify those problems. So I thought I'd just go over some of the things that we've seen on oak this year. As a group, oaks are tremendously important. There's been books written about the benefits and value of oaks to civilization, and oaks they support a lot of different species of plants and animals. This was a shot that I took earlier this year, Christmas lichen on a live oak, and also resurrection fern. So a lot of things that we see on oaks are really no problem at all. And a lot of things that I'm going to mention are not a huge problem, but we do get questions about them. Occasionally we do see, I'll go over some abiotic things now. Occasionally we do see cold injury on oaks, especially those in the landscape. They're close to a fertilized lawn and they are slow to go into dormancy, and we have a sudden drop in temperature, then the cambium can be killed, and you'll have bark that splits and falls away from the tree, which essentially ruins it. Back in 2007, if you remember that Easter freeze, there was a lot of damage to nursery stock, including oaks. Didn't kill them, but certainly did a lot of damage because they were all already actively growing when we had that freeze. And oaks are, just as susceptible to injury from hail and other things as any other tree. This damage is going to be, the leaf may be shredded, tattered. You'll see wounds on the upper surface of the twigs where hail hit it, and sometimes it can do a lot of damage to young trees. This tree happened to be from a landscape in Murfreesboro where there was a hailstorm a few years ago. Last year, someone mentioned an oak down at the Nolensville, just south of Nashville, a cemetery that had been struck by lightning, and I went to go look at it. And we do get questions about trees that are struck by lightning. Are they going to die? Are they going to live? And well, the answer is we don't know. Sometimes a tree will die rapidly after it's been struck by lightning, and sometimes it'll form callus tissue around the wound and just keep on trucking. The other thing that we're asked a lot about is herbicide injury on oaks. And one thing that you can tell here is that earlier in the season, a herbicide was applied when the tree was actively growing that damaged the leaves. This is could have been 2,4-D or dicamba, phenoxy herbicide injury. But the other thing that you see is that once the initial injury happened and the herbicide was no longer in the environment, the tree produced another flush of growth, which was healthy. And this is what often happens. So often it's not the end of the world. If you do get some damage, you just hope that you don't get it every year. Timing, of course, is everything. But most trees will recover. Just depends on the dose and what stage they're hit, and how often they're hit by herbicide injury. This was an interesting sample this summer. We've had a sample from this landscape before. It was the same problem, and we weren't able to figure it out. The soil test really didn't show us a lot. I think when we did a plant tissue analysis, this is from Nashville. Our Nashville soils tend to be more alkaline. This was a manganese deficiency on oak. So one thing is that it's great to do soil testing, but if you do see some problems on oaks and the soil test itself doesn't clear up, there's always plant tissue analysis that will actually tell you which nutrients are actually there in the leaf and at what level. So it's really value. And that's something that we can do here. This was down in Murfreesboro a few years ago on Medical Center Parkway, willow oak with kind of iron chlorosis. And soil pH was high. Would have been easier to deal with this if the soil pH had been adjusted prior to planting. But certainly there are some tools that arborists have to work on iron chlorosis on oak. Sometimes we'll recommend an iron chelate just to see if that's what it is, and spray it on the tree and see if it greens up. And if it does green up, then that gives you a hint that at least that you're dealing with an iron deficiency. Sometimes we'll recommend trying to adjust the pH using ammonium sulfate or sulfur, but it can be a long process. One of the diseases that tends to hit oaks with iron chlorosis is Tubacia leaf spot, where you'll see some necrosis associated with oaks that have iron chlorosis. And it can happen to oaks in the red oak family. It can happen to willow oaks, where you see Tubacia leaf spot here, and it's associated with iron chlorosis. Now this is from last year. This is Tubacia leaf spot on an oak in the red oak family. Here we're seeing larger lesions, and if we look at those a little closely, we actually see the fungus. The fungus looks like looks kind of like a shield, and the spores are produced there. And if you look on the lower right-hand photo, you'll see actually the fruiting bodies of Tubacia. We used to call this actinopelty, but the name got changed. Like so many of the leaf spots that you see on oaks, this is generally not anything that's considered very serious. Sometimes Tubacia shows up late summer or even into the fall, and the tree has stored all the energy it needs to, so not a huge problem. This is from this year. This is oak leaf blister. This is an interesting fungus. This is one of the sac fungi, and the sac fungi produce their spores in little sacs called asci. And oak leaf blister uh, is something that we'll see early in the spring. The fungus is active right when the leaf buds start to expand. And generally it does very little damage to an oak. It can tolerate it very well. So if we took one of these lesions and we looked at it microscopically, this is a fabulous photo from Bruce Watt when he was at the University of Maine, showing the asci that are on that blister and the ascospores inside that are being released. With diseases like this, peach leaf curl, oak leaf blister, if you were going to try to control this, you would apply a fungicide before leaf expansion. And you, basically, anytime after leaf drop in the fall until the leaves expand in the spring, you could spray one time and control this if you wanted to. Now, interesting disease that's been a frequent flyer here at the lab this summer is fungal leaf spot disease called Monachia leaf spot. And I think one of the first people to send this to me was Dr. Karen Hughes, a mycologist over at on campus in Knoxville. And the first time I saw it, I thought, well, it's probably just leaf blister, oak leaf blister. And Karen was like, no, I don't think so. So I started digging, and what I found was that there was a fungus sporulating in these spots, and the fungus name is Monachia. And the good news is that even though it looks bad, generally the leaves don't drop. They'll hang on all summer. So it does very little damage. But this certainly is something that we saw most of the summer on oaks from the red oak family. But not a problem. But just know if you see it that it is a fungal leaf spot. This is oak anthracnose. This is from local college campus here in town in Nashville this summer. Notice how the infection just follows the veins, and then it follows the major veins, and then it follows the secondary veins, just like little rivers or little tributaries. And you would see similar symptoms to this on sycamore that's infected with anthracnose. But I saw this late spring, early summer, not doing a lot of damage to this white oak. What often happens with the anthracnose diseases of shade trees is that they're active when we're having cool, wet weather like we had in the spring here. But as soon as it gets hot and drier, it basically stops. And that's what happened to this. So looks interesting, but again, not a huge problem. Now this actually came in today. This is October 7th, Wednesday, October 7th. Amy Desmukes, the Tennessee State University nursery specialist, brought this in. And this is a disease, I think this is purple spot. Like oak leaf blister, it's caused by a fungus in the ascomycetes. It's one of the sac fungi. It produces spores in an ascus. And from what little I know about this, again, I think this is not a huge problem. It's simply an aesthetic problem. However, if you have a nursery and you've got oaks and they're covered up with this and you have people visiting, this is probably not something that you would want on it. So as far as control, I think probably most fungicides that are labeled for leaf spots would work on this. But this is called purple spot. At least I think that's what it is. And again, not a huge problem. Now, there are times that we get some really interesting photos, and this next one came in last fall. This is, I think for symptoms of a disease, this one's actually kind of attractive. This is on chestnut oak. This is a disease called bullseye leaf spot, and the fungus is Cristulariella, and it produces a zonate spot on several different trees, sassafras, maple. I've seen it on European hornbeam. So you'll see this on several trees, and all the spots can look a little bit different, but usually they're zonate like this. Looks really dramatic. Generally, it's a late season, maybe even early fall disease, so it doesn't show up until later in the year, so not a huge deal. This was actually from Dalton, Georgia. Someone posted it and asked for some help identifying it, and I asked them to send samples, and they were kind enough to do that. So we've got it here in the herbarium, but really nice sample of a leaf spot disease. So we're going to transition a little bit to powdery mildews. And kind of when I've talked to master gardeners, kind of a rule of thumb is that powdery mildews show up on the upper leaf surface and downy mildews show up on the lower leaf surface. And that's usually true, but not in the case of some of the powdery mildews that hit oaks. The powdery mildews that you'll see on pin oak and oaks in the red oak family are often, the signs of disease are often on the underside of the leaf, all that white mycelial growth. And the symptoms from the infection are on the upper side, kind of the browning, early fall color. Now, English oak tends to be pretty susceptible to powdery mildew. It does follow our rules, so it's a little better behaved. And on this, we'll usually see white mildew, often by early summer to midsummer on the upper leaf surface. Now, if we've got a microscope and we looked at this leaf, and say it about 400 times, we would see, this is a photo that I took actually on a rose leaf that had powdery mildew, but it would be similar on just about any plant that has powdery mildew. And this is the asexual stage of the fungus where the spores are produced in chains. And what happens here is that just about every day, the most mature spore is at the tip of these chains and it'll break off and blow away. And as long as humidity is high, it'll land on a leaf at random. And if it's an oak, then it will germinate and infect the leaf. So just imagine, this is one tiny little portion of a colony of powdery mildew, and there's a lot of spores being produced here. And then the next day, the next mature spore will break off, blow away, and just at random they'll hit. But there's enough of them breaking off and blowing away that often they will hit a target host, start a new colony. So how do powdery mildews overwinter? If you look on a leaf, an oak leaf with powdery mildew at this time of year, and you'll see the white mycelium, if you look a little closer, you'll see these little yellow to tan to black spheres all over the surface of the bottom of the leaf. And what those are this is an ascomycete 2, and it's the fruiting bodies. The lower right-hand corner here, we've got what this would look like. This is one called phylactinia. This is powdery mildew, and this is the fruiting body of the fungus that is the overwintering stage. So what's going to happen is in the spring, let's look at this upper right-hand corner. This will burst open. Those little sacs full of ascospores will be ejected, and the spores will infect oak and start the disease cycle all over again. So where does the fungus overwinter? It overwinters in leaf litter. If you'd like to see less powdery mildew, one thing that you could do is either chop the leaves very finely so that they deteriorate quickly, or if you're good at composting and your compost pile goes through a heat, you could throw them in the compost pile and that would kill most any fungi, but it has to go through a pretty significant heat to do that. So let's move on to the rust diseases of oak. This is a rust, leaf rust on bur oak, and I think there also probably was some aphid damage here too, causing the gnarly looking leaves. But this was an oak that I planted in Murfreesboro, bur oak, several years ago. And one summer it was just covered up with this leaf rust. So didn't do a lot of damage. I wasn't all that concerned about it. And the interesting thing was the next year it did come back. So it's just one of those kind of freaks of nature. There are several, or at least a couple of different pine oak rust. And this is a rust that goes back and forth from red oak to oaks in the red oak family to pines. The further south you'll go, you'll find this. In the spring of the year, if you're down south in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, you might see pines. You might see this yellow spores being produced on the stems of pines. And this is fusiform rust. And those spores actually do not infect the pine, but they're actually windblown and infect oak leaves. So over the summer, the fungus produces, summer it's growing on the oak leaf, and then by late summer it's producing another spore stage that blows back to the pines and infects them. Very minor disease of oak, but very serious disease of some of our southern pines like loblolly pine. Now here in Tennessee, in Middle Tennessee and East Tennessee, on Virginia pine, you might see eastern gall rust, which is also a pine oak rust, and it goes from Virginia pine to oaks in the red oak family. And if you see the middle picture here, it shows the spore stage that you'll see on the galls on the pines, but they're actually being windblown and infect the oaks. And the spores produced in late summer in oaks will blow back and infect twigs on Virginia pine. Not really a serious disease of either tree, just more of an interesting thing. So this next disease is something that I'm asked about every year, and actually someone here in Nashville asked me about this yesterday, and this is called smooth patch. It's called smooth patch or white patch. It's a fungal problem. It's not really a disease. What this fungus does, it consumes the bark of the tree, but doesn't really get into the cambium, the living tissue of the tree. So you get these smooth patches where it's consuming the bark, but it's not really causing a lot of harm. Usually trees that have the trunks that look like this with smooth patches, the canopies look fine, so there's no huge problem. Now, when you look at this closely, you often do not see the fungus that's actually growing there, or at least nothing that you can identify as the fungus. But sometimes after a rain, if you go and look at these smooth patches, you'll see these little white disc-shaped fruiting bodies of the fungus. It's called, the fungus name is Larodiscus oaksii. I guess somebody named Oaks identified this. But I saw this here locally in Brentwood, and it was actually, the fungus was producing fruiting bodies after rain. Definitely pretty dramatic when you see it, and some people might confuse this with a canker disease, but it's not. Usually the cambium underneath this is growing well and the tree's not at risk. Just to show you how small these fruiting bodies are, I collected some, and I've got a penny here for comparison of size. So they're pretty small. You could easily overlook these. So that's smooth patch. So this next disease is really common on pin oak. It's probably the tree I see it most often on, these fruiting bodies here. It's another ascomycete, and this is Endothea canker. The fungus is actually, I wouldn't say closely related, but it is related to the fungus that causes chestnut blight. And these orange-red fruiting bodies are probably the easiest sign of disease when you see Endothea canker on a pin oak. This was actually a branch. I took this photo in West Tennessee at UT Martin. I had one visit there on a pin oak that was stressed, and it's under Endothea canker. So that's the thing about some of the canker diseases, is they often, you'll see them on trees that are stressed, maybe due to the environment, the location, maybe not the greatest site for them to be planted. Now this was an interesting sample. These actually all came in together. This is from West Tennessee, and we've actually got 3 different fungi on one sample. And the little white mushrooms here, it looks like smooth patch, but it's not. This is actually a little wood decay fungus called Schizophilum, and it's got white. More on that at the end. Get these little white mushrooms that grow, and it's a wood decay fungus. Usually find that, usually where you see that, the wood is dead. Then in the middle here, we have Endothea canker again. And then on the right here, we've got hypoxylon canker and that black stroma, which is just really tightly bound fungal mycelium. And really all of these are not, I don't know that you'd call any of them really aggressive pathogens. Hypoxylon on the right here, you often see on trees that are under stress, that are close to death anyway, and it just kind of finishes them off. Endothea, like I said, stressed pin oaks, some that have obscure scale infestations, some that may have bacterial leaf scorch. You'll see Endothea canker. And then the Schizophilum here, as I mentioned, you're going to find this on dead branches. It's not a pathogen. And there are other fungi that will kill actually the trunk, cause a good bit of damage on an oak. This is one called Stromella. Often you'll see callus tissue forming around the edge of the canker. You may see bark still attached to the cankered area, and it can cause quite a bit of damage. And you'll find this on several tree species. One of the things that you might find where you're out walking on the woods is the sexual stage of the fungus Stromella that causes that canker. This is this is Ernula, or the gray ern fungus, and growing as a saprophyte on some dead wood. But it's just another spore stage, or another stage of the fungus that causes that large canker on oaks and some other trees. Back to hypoxylon. This is a few years ago. This is down at the state capitol. Some of the oaks were, I think these were willow oaks mainly, really stressed. Not sure what was causing the stress, but wow, they were just about the whole trunk was nothing but one large hypoxylon canker. And one of the interesting things about hypoxylon, the stroma in this case is kind of gray to tan looking, forms underneath the bark. And as it grows, it will just push off the bark, and the bark just sheds on the ground underneath the tree. This is a good example of just bark shedding where you have hypoxylon canker and the fungus is growing underneath the bark, and as it expands, it just pushes off the bark. And it's not the primary cause of the tree dying, but it sure shows up near the end on a lot of trees. This is from this summer. This is actually a perennial canker, probably Nectaria canker. And in this case, the fungus hits the tree every year, and the tree forms callus tissue every year. So you get kind of a bullseye type canker on the tree. And not particularly common, but you could run into this. There are probably other trees where Nectaria canker is more common. Middle Tennessee, I'd say sassafras, it's more common to see Nectaria canker on it. And then moving on to, this is always a frequent flyer in the lab in late summer and fall when symptoms of bacterial leaf scorch start showing up. And really our poster child for bacterial leaf scorch in Tennessee is pin oak. And what usually happens is that you'll have a tree like this that starts turning brown much earlier than normal. You'll see leaf scorch, and the scorch can vary from tree to tree. Sometimes it'll look kind of purple with some scorch around it, or often you'll see some green tissue with scorch. And usually it's semi-mature to mature trees that you'll find this on. This is a pathogen that's spread by insects. It's spread by sharpshooter leaf hoppers. The glassy wing sharpshooter and the blue-green sharpshooter can both pick up the bacterium in the xylem, go to another tree, feed, and spread the disease. and it's quite common. Bacterial leaf scorch is quite common. This is from a few years ago on the Middle Tennessee State campus. I think this tree is gone now. And the trees just, what happens is over the years is the canopy, each year the canopy just shrinks and gets smaller and smaller until the tree dies. There's not a cure for this. There are some treatments that arborists will try, and if you have a tree of historical significance or a huge specimen tree, you probably would have to catch it very early to be effective, but you could talk to a certified arborist about this. Just remember though, there's no cure for this. This shows kind of a progression of symptoms of bacterial leaf scorch on pin oak. This was at the Oakland's house in Murfreesboro, the main drive going in, and it just essentially took out all of these trees. And you'll see the tree on the right just hardly affected, the one in the middle showing a lot of necrosis, and the one on the left just has that canopy that's just kind of shrinking. On my drive to work, I drive through a neighborhood that has lots of mature pin oaks, and this is a pretty common sight these days. This neighborhood's about, the homes were built about 50 to 70 years ago, and that's about the stage where you really start to see lots of symptoms from bacterial leaf scorch. So I've seen several trees removed on my route to work this summer. Now, something that I'm asked about is a fungal disease, a fungal wilt disease, oak wilt. And I'll have to be honest here, actually, I've never seen this disease in Tennessee. Some of the foresters with the Division of Forestry assure me that it is here, but I have asked them for samples, and so far I haven't gotten a sample. Doesn't mean it's not here, but I just have not seen it. All I would say is if it is here, it's not really common. And depending on the oak species that you see, the symptoms can be different. I think on the left there is live oak leaves with oak wilt symptoms. On the right, it's an oak in the red oak family. And I think one of the things that would make this a little different from bacterial leaf scorch is that often you would see leaves shedding from a tree that has oak wilt, and they'd be shedding, a lot of leaves shedding really early. You generally don't see that with bacterial leaf scorch. Then the other symptom, the symptoms that I really love to see if someone thought they had oak wilt, just like hypoxylin pushes the bark off. When the bark starts splitting on a tree that has oak wilt on the trunk, underneath the bark, you'll see this pressure pad of the fungus and fungal growth under the bark. That's it's called a pressure pad, key symptom there. On some oaks, you might see some vascular discoloration, as you would with verticillium wilt on maple, but that's not always a key symptom. And it can be tricky to isolate. But just keep in mind the wilts in oak in Tennessee, bacterial leaf scorch is really common and oak wilt is not. So let's talk a little bit about sudden oak death. And this is Phytophthora ramorum. These are some images that I took out in California several years ago on coastal live oak. And sudden oak death is actually a canker disease. It's a Phytophthora disease, produces a canker, and it can, on trees, on the ornamental shrubs and things that we get into the nursery industry sometimes that are infected, that are shipped in, it tends to be a foliar blight or a twig blight. But on trees where it causes death, it's usually the canker on the trunk that causes the biggest problem. This has not really been a problem on oaks in Tennessee that I'm aware of, or anywhere in the eastern United States. Generally, when we get word of this, it's Phytophthora ramorum causing a disease called Phytophthora blight on rhododendron, mountain laurel, camellia, plants like that. I think the latest introduction was in 2019, and I think it was on rhododendron from the West Coast. So there were plants that were shipped in. I don't think there were any that were confirmed, but they were confirmed in other states from this nursery. So just keep in mind that Phytophthora remorum causes a blight of nursery stock that's sometimes shipped in from the West Coast. But as far as our oaks, I just don't know of anywhere that you would find Phytophthora remorum causing dieback on our native oaks in the Southeast. All right, let's talk a little bit about the fungi. I had some questions about these this year. The fungi that cause root rots and butt rot. The butt of the trunk is right at ground level, and there are fungi that will attack the roots and the bud. And even if some that are not pathogens, but if they cause wood decay and can destroy wood that's holding up that tree. So what you'll often see is that trees that are affected by bud or root rot are wind thrown after a storm. Now, this is one that I saw this summer. This is the weeping polypore. This is Ornamental striatus. And this is not a good thing to see around an older oak because it is a significant problem. It's considered a pathogen and also a saprophyte causing wood decay. What we're looking at here is the fruiting body of the fungus. Most of the body of the fungus is within probably the root tissue or the buttress roots that are supporting the weight of the tree. Kind of a rule of thumb, this is a pin oak that I saw in Murfreesboro a few years ago where I took these shots of these innonotus conchs around the base. This is not a good sign to see them this far around the trunk. When I went back by this site this summer, this tree was dead, still standing but dead. And it may not have been killed by innonotus, but certainly this fungus, you would rather not see this around an oak. And usually you'll see it on older oaks. A fungus that you might run into right now is armillaria. Produces these clusters of mushrooms, and it causes a root rot. It produces it's really interesting. It's called oak root rot. Sometimes it's called shoestring root rot because this fungus can produce these strings or dark black shoestring-like structures called rhizomorphs. It's all mycelium, but they will cover they'll cover the roots and just kill it, cause wood decay, and it can be, you'll find these on older trees normally. These were some clusters of armillaria mushrooms that I saw down on the Natchez Trace, and they're probably feeding on the roots of oaks or other trees underneath the ground here. So trees can last a long time that have armillaria, but if you're not sure, ask an arborist to come out and inspect the tree and give you an opinion. So let's move on to some wood decay fungi that are common on oaks and we get asked about. One of the more common ones are some of the bracket or shelf fungi that are kind of shiny on top. They're called laccate or lacquered. This is a Ganoderma. This is Curtisii, very common on southern oaks. This is a species called Ganoderma sessile. Doesn't have a stalk, just right there on the tree, associated with wood decay. Not a great thing to see because, again, you're just seeing the fruiting body. Most of the fungus is behind the bark, feeding on maybe on the secondary wood that's there to hold up the weight of the tree. So never a good thing to see lots of Ganoderma conchs around a tree that you like. This is the artist conch. It's a really interesting, I mean, all of these Ganoderma conchs produce, this is different species, is Ganoderma applanatum. This one produces a lot of spores. So imagine a fungus, just one of these conchs can produce 350,000 spores per second. And an average size conch will produce those spores for 6 months of the year. So that's about 5.4 trillion spores from one conch. So lots of spores. Most likely, well, almost all of those will never survive, but a few will find somewhere to germinate and affect a tree, but most will not. And these conchs can live for up to 10 years. So one of the things I had on Facebook last week, right, actually I think it was earlier this week, was a post about the jack-o'-lantern mushroom that's often found around oaks. And it's a saprophyte. Usually it's growing on dead wood. It shows up in the fall, bright orange, generally easy to identify. One of the interesting things about the jack-o'-lantern mushroom is that it is one of the bioluminescent mushrooms that will actually glow in the dark. So on Monday of this week, a friend of mine, David Clement, sent me this photo where he had collected some jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, taken them into a dark room, and said it took several minutes for his eyes to adjust to the dark, but they actually did glow. They are bioluminescent, and it's actually a chemical called oxyluciferin, and it's the same chemical that you'd see in fireflies, but it takes this chemical, it takes an enzyme, and it takes oxygen for this bioluminescence to occur. And you may have heard of foxfire in the woods, where you have these glowing mushrooms. There's about 75 mushrooms that are bioluminescent, but the jack-o'-lantern probably, and actually armillaria that I mentioned earlier, they both are bioluminescent. So just kind of interesting thing. We do get questions about the jack-o'-lantern mushroom because people do see it at this time of year around the base of oaks. And then just a little bit on wood decay. When you have an older oak, and sometimes you'll see a branch break out. Often what happens is not long after that, you'll see just the whole tree just fall apart because of decay in its heart rot, and you'll see branches break off and the tree has to be removed. So if you ever have any questions about wood decay, if a tree is a hazard or not, always contact a certified arborist to come out and give you a consult. They have the experience to know if the tree is going to be a hazard. If it's close to anything of value, house, driveway, sidewalk, streets, power lines, definitely get an arborist to come out, take a look. So this is just kind of a funny thing. This is years ago. I saw this. I thought, wow, that's a neat conch. And actually, when I got closer to it and looked, it was actually somebody had placed a tennis shoe in a knot hole, and the tree had grown around it. So I call this the shoe conch. But just kind of a fun thing. You don't see this very often, but there's no telling how long the shoe had been in that tree. Also, in wood decay, this is a tree that I saw. I actually helped cut this up when this branch failed in this water oak. Water oak's a fast-growing tree, but it is susceptible to wood decay as it gets older. You can see conchs on this big branch. There's significant decay there. This is the fungus called Phalinus, and water oak is one of the trees that you'll often see this on. This is actually one of the conchs that I collected, have in my herbarium here at the office. It's a polypore, doesn't have gills, it has pores underneath. But the wood behind the bark here is all kind of light, punky, kind of a white rot that it causes. Mr. Kaufman, that was our diagnostician for 11 years here, sent me this image this summer. This is Ganoderma lobatum. It's a wood decay fungus. Generally, it's a perennial conch, produces a new conch below the older one. The older one's on top, the newer one's on bottom, and it's kind of fragile, but it's not a shiny lacquered like some of the other Ganoderma, but it is a wood decay fungus. I think he said he saw this on an oak stump. Other wood decay fungi, the sulfur shelf mushrooms. There's actually two in Tennessee that we see. One is Latoporus cincinnatus, and one is the true sulfur, the Latoporus sulphureus. Sometimes the sulphureus, the yellow one, we'll see more up on the trunk or on branches higher up in the tree. And often the cincinnatus, the one that looks kind of orangey or pink, will be on the roots at the base of the tree down on the butt, but generally they're causing wood decay. There's dead wood there. And again, this is just the fruiting body. The bulk of this body of this fungus is within the tree. This is a Lattiporus cincinnatus growing on a white oak roots here at the center, here at Ellington Center in Nashville from a few years ago. And it's not uncommon if you have large oaks to find Ganoderma conchs and sometimes these Lattiporus conchs growing side by side. Just tell you there's, that there's some decay there. And again, might be a good time to have a consult from an arborist, especially if it's close to a building. This is a large white oak that's being taken down at the old YMCA in Murfreesboro. And it had Ganoderma and Lattiporus conchs growing at the base of it. And probably, these were old. These are two old white oaks. They were there when this building was built. Probably not protected like they should have been. So there was probably a lot of damage. There was a slow decline on the one on the left. The conchs were there. Don't know how much they had to do with the decline, but definitely not a good sign to see them at the base. I took this shot of the tree when it was cut, and you can see the pockets of decay that are there, either from the Ganoderma or the Lattiporus. But there was still a lot of sound wood around the outside of this tree, but the tree definitely was in some serious decline when it was taken out. And actually, this tree was actually leaning toward the wellness center at the YMCA, so not a good thing. And I think that's why it was taken out, because of the fungi growing around the base. So again, another good reason to talk to an arborist is because they can often tell you that some wood decay fungi will be more damaging to some species of trees, and on other species is really slow and not as serious. But arborists know that kind of thing. This is actually a kind of a fun one. This is a wood decay fungus, sometimes called lion's mane fungus. This was on an old water oak here in Nashville, and it's one of the toothed fungi where it produces basidius spores on these teeth. And have been asked about this year. So I don't comment on the edibility of mushrooms, but I know that there are people that collect this, but never eat a mushroom based on my identification. That's what I always say. But it's really an interesting fungus when you see it. And it's the lion's mane fungus, Hericium erinaceus. There's actually about 3 different species in this genus that we see, and they're quite beautiful. And we've been asked about 2 of the 3 of them this summer. And then I mentioned, this earlier. This is Schizophilum communing. This is one of the most common wood decay fungi that we see on trees. We often see it on oaks. We see it on maples. Sometimes on young trees where there's been dieback, you'll see these little fragile looking white mushrooms. It didn't kill the tree, but it's there consuming the wood that's dead. So this is Schizophilum, one of the most common wood decay fungi in the world. It's been said that you can find this fungus on 6 of the 7 continents. Antarctica is the only one that it doesn't occur on. So there you have it. There's kind of an overview of oak diseases, and hope that you learned something from this. And when you talk to people about oaks and they ask you questions, that you'll know more about it. And certainly it's an interesting group of trees. They're very valuable. A lot of the things I mentioned are just aesthetic type problems, especially the leaf spots. Don't cause that much harm. It's the bud rots, root rots, wood decay fungi that we worry most about when we see those around oaks. So I think that's it. I'm going to wrap up. I think I'm just about right at an hour. And thank you so much for watching this. If we can ever help you at the Soil Plant and Pest Center, feel free to contact us about sending us samples. And we've got a great new diagnostician here, Eleanor Phillips Lopez from the University of Florida Doctor of Plant Medicine program. And she's really good. And our soil lab, of course, is operated all summer. Do you have any soil samples to send in this fall? It's a great time to send in samples. And we can, as I said, we can also do plant tissue analysis. And I hope you have a great fall, and thank you for watching.